The man, the myth, the legend of Mr. Edgar Allan Poe.
And his 6 degrees of connection to everything.
Literature,
Pop culture,
sci-fi science,
surrealism,
horror,
Poe places.
Join us on most major podcast platforms,
including our YouTube, Poe Unplugged. By a route obscure and lonely, haunted by ill angels only, where an eidolon named Night on a black throne reigns upright. I have reached these lands but newly, from an ultimate dim foolery, from a wild weird clime that lieth sublime, out of space, out of time. Greetings, Poe fans, and welcome back to one of our debris episodes. Jeannie, what are we focusing on this month?
Oh, we're focusing on something that is near and dear to my heart, the good old horror of it all. Horror, and especially the horror that, Poe brought us, but also we're going to talk a lot about how Poe influenced other horror writers, specifically, H.P. Lovecraft. And because of our tie-in with H.P. Lovecraft, we are going to have 2 special guests joining us during this episode. Now, Carmen, would you like to introduce these wonderful guests for us, please?
Yes, our first, and one other thing we want to say is fans requested us to do an episode on Lovecraft. So this is, people are waiting for this one. So we're excited to please the fans. And so our first guest is Donovan Laux. So Donovan, if you'll give us a little background about you.
Sure thing. I'm a retired software developer, and about, my goodness, almost 30 years ago, I started a Lovecraft website called the HP Lovecraft Archive. And I think in 98, so what's that, about 26 years ago, I acquired the hplovecraft.com domain.
Okay.
I started using that for my site. And so that's kind of my claim to fame in Lovecraft circles is, running the HP Lovecraft Archive for all that time.
Mm-hmm.
It started out with half a dozen pages one weekend, and now it's like 700 pages with a database behind the scenes. And so that's kind of what I do.
Okay.
Hi.
Welcome to our podcast, and we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
And our next guest with us, and you have seen him with us before, is Levi Leland.
That's right. Thank you, Carmen. So for the fans that don't know, the listeners that don't know, I'm Levi. I created the walking tour of Poe's Providence, kind of carving out my niche in Providence, Rhode Island, is kind of like the Poe guy, the guy connecting Poe's ties to Providence, and Sarah Helen Whitman, of course. Mm-hmm. I'm a good friend of Donovan's. We met through our kind of mutual love of walking tours and the Poe scene in Providence, but of course Lovecraft, who has an even bigger tie to Providence, obviously, kind of rooted Donovan there in the city, and that's kind of how we connected. He came on my walking tour, and he's taught me a lot as far as Lovecraft goes in Providence, and even some aspects of Poe's time in Providence that I kind of was little shaky on before I met him. So yeah, it's been a great connection, a great kind of collaboration of minds and fans.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I've been on 2 of Levi's tours, and he's been on 1.5 of mine.
Right. 1.5. That's right.
And Donovan, do you give the tours, or I know you have the walking tour map, and so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, on HP Lovecraft Archive, I've got a walking tour map of sites related to Lovecraft in Providence, and it's about a 3-mile tour. So it's up and down College Hill. It's a steep hill. I refer to it as Mount College. A lot of local folks aren't ready for the hike up and down that hill, but that's been on my website for quite a while now. But we also do tours during the Necronomicon, which is a convention in honor of Lovecraft every 2 years.
Okay.
So I'm in charge of those tours, and I give a couple tours during that as well.
Okay. And what time of year does that event take
It's
place?
it's always on the weekend closest to Lovecraft's birthday, which is August 20th.
Okay. All
So
right.
it's at one of the most humid times of the year.
Yes. Yes. I was going to say my wedding anniversary is late August, and it was a very southern humid day, the day we got married. So, but yeah, walking up hills in humidity is not fun, but yeah. But the Lovecraft stuff would be amazing. So let's just jump right into Lovecraft's background, who he was, what he did. And I know he was born in Providence and he died in Providence. So
Yep.
Donovan, I was going to say you know Lovecraft more than we do. So take it away.
All right. So some background here on Lovecraft. Like you said, he was born here in Providence, August 20th, 1890, and died here March 15th, 1937. So
Okay.
he spent nearly all his life here. There's, a few years he spent in the Boston area when he was very young, and a couple of years in New York City when he was married. But other than that, he lived and died within a 2-mile radius here in
Wow.
Providence.
Okay.
So on August 20th, 1890, he was born at his grandfather's house. And it's kind of an unusual background there. His mother and father were married a couple of years before that up in Boston. His father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, was a salesman for the Gorham Silversmith Company here in Providence. And so he was living in Boston, but traveling around to cafeterias and restaurants and hotels selling silverware to these kind of organizations.
Okay.
How he met Lovecraft's mother is not quite clear. Her name was Sarah Susan Phillips.
Okay.
She went by her middle name, Susie. That's how her family knew her. So
Hmm.
the two of them were married up in Boston, apparently without her parents present. So a
Oh,
very peculiar situation there.
okay.
And but when she became pregnant with Howard and was going to give birth, she came down here to her grandfather's house, or excuse me, to her father's house here
Okay.
in Providence. And his name was Whipple Van Buren Phillips, and he was a fairly wealthy guy. He started his life in Western Rhode Island
Hmm.
and had like bought the local grocery store and built that into a business. And then there was a nearby town and the railroad was coming through. And he bought up all that property and renamed the town and pretty much owned that town and
Okay.
made so much money he ended up moving to Providence and investing in various things. He had a big Victorian house here on the east side. But so like I said, when Susie was pregnant, she came back to Providence where she had lived with her father and her mother and sisters
Hmm.
and had Howard here. But then after she had recovered, that she went back up to Boston with her husband Winfield. So Lovecraft was born here in his grandfather's house, but really spent the first couple of years, 2, 3 years, living up in the Boston area with his parents. Well, as I mentioned, his father was a salesman who traveled around selling for Gorham Silversmiths. And
Hmm.
when Lovecraft was 3, his father was smitten with this fit. He was in Chicago and he had this episode where he said some men in the next room were assaulting his wife. And
Wow.
yet his wife was back in the Boston area. Turns out he at some point had acquired neurosyphilis. It was in the late stages, and he was brought back here to Providence and put in Butler Hospital, which is still a psychiatric hospital to this day. It's probably the oldest one in the US. And so with that, Howard and his mother came back to Providence and lived here with her father.
Okay.
So that was kind of the home he grew up in. Really, for the next 11 years, till he was 14 years old, he lived in his grandfather's house with his mother.
Okay.
His two aunts got married at various times, but he grew up to a great extent in that house with his grandfather as his father figure.
Okay. Okay.
And his grandfather, again, a big Victorian house, wealthy fellow, a lot of books, statuary, paintings, and so on. Lovecraft talks about it at length. And Lovecraft really liked this home. He wasn't much for Victorian architecture, but this was his birthplace.
Hmm.
He had a great respect for that building. And so growing up in his grandfather's house, he um, had the opportunity to read a lot of literature on his own. In fact, that's kind of the story of Lovecraft's life. He's quite the autodidact. He didn't go to school very well, shall we say. Had a lot of problems in school. Didn't finish high school technically, probably was only in high school for about 3.5 years. Most of his knowledge was learned on his own reading.
Hmm.
So in his grandfather's library, he got a fascination at the start for things like the Arabian Nights, and in fact, pretended he was an Arab when he was young and going on adventures and so on. And someone in the family, possibly the family lawyer, came up with a nickname for him, Abdul al-Hazred, which eventually he used as the author for his fictional work, the Necronomicon, which we'll probably talk about more later.
Okay.
And then he went on, he discovered Greek and Roman mythology. But then at age 8, he discovered Poe. And we'll talk after I get through his bio more about that influence, because that was a big change in Lovecraft's life.
Yeah,
Because
and I was going to ask how old he was when he discovered Poe. So yeah, and we can definitely visit that in a little bit. Yeah.
yeah, so he was just 8 years old, and he later in life referred to Poe as his god of fiction.
Wow.
That was really what changed his direction when it came to writing. Because as a young boy, he wrote, amusing little stories, a few of which are still extant, but he really turned on the horror once he discovered Poe.
Okay.
And he also, living in his grandfather's house, he discovered the sciences. So he discovered chemistry and astronomy. And so all these things really contributed to who Lovecraft would become.
Hmm.
And while he was living in his grandfather's house, he underwent quite a few losses. So, for example, I mentioned when he was only 3 years old, his father ended up in an asylum. When he was 6 years old, his grandmother died.
Okay.
And then when he was 8 years old, his father died. And when he was 14 years old, his grandfather died. A lot of bad business dealings gone wrong, and his grandfather ended up dying of a stroke. And so a lot of those business failures could have easily led to Whipple dying.
Right.
So as a result of all that, suddenly the family, and at this point, the family consists of just Howard and his mother, Susie, found they were without a house and without much money. And so they moved into a much smaller home. It was a double house at
Mhm.
598 Angel Street. And so a double house is basically one big house that's built for two families with in this case, a west half and an east half.
Okay.
He complains about another family being on the other side of the wall because he was used to growing up in this big Victorian house with servants and stables and land and a big library and statuary in the house, like I said earlier. So it was really quite a change for him. And during this time, he's going to school and he's got friends, he's got local friends and what have you. But he is a peculiar, precocious little boy that's doted on by his mother. And in high school, he only manages, as I said, to do about 3.5 years of high school.
Okay.
So one of the things he wanted to do, because of his interest in the sciences, he really wanted to become an astronomer. But he claims his math just wasn't good enough. He obviously did, since he didn't graduate from Hope High School, and he couldn't go on to Brown University. But he says his math just wasn't good enough. We actually have his grades, and
Very neat.
he's got decent algebra. He's getting A's and B's in algebra,
Okay.
but he must have known better that, he just wasn't up to snuff on it.
Okay. Mhm.
Heck, I remember getting straight A's on all my calculus tests in high school, but I still managed to flunk. So,
Mhm.
so your grades aren't necessarily an indication,
Of knowledge, right? Yeah.
right? So he didn't go on to do that. But what he did do is write. And there's a period from about when he was 18 to 23 that Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi, I think, referred to as his blank period, where we're not quite sure what he did then, but he was clearly depressed and kind of wasting away his time. And one of the things he did is he read a lot of popular fiction, which at that time came in the form of the pulp magazines. That was when the pulps were starting to appear. He read lots of pulps. And when we think about pulps, we think of Weird Tales, where he was eventually published, and we think of Astounding Stories and these exciting things. But he was reading stuff like Railroad Man's Weekly or something like that, where it's literally a magazine for guys that work on the railroad. He was reading everything.
Wow.
And he talks about how he would be reading these things cover to cover. And one of the ones he was reading was the Argosy All Story. where it was a magazine that had all kinds of stories. So there was,
Mhm.
horror and science fiction and detective and romance and all kinds of things in it. And this magazine had a letters column in it where people would write in and say, "Oh, I like this story. I hated that story. What do you think of this?" That sort of thing. And there was a fellow named, I think it was Fred Jackson, who wrote really lame romance stories. And Lovecraft decided to get into what we would now consider a flame war in the letters column of this magazine. And Lovecraft took it to the next level. He wasn't just writing letters like, "I don't like Fred Jackson." He was writing parodies and he was writing little essays. He was writing poetry and um, and going toe to toe with other writers in these columns. And at that time, not only were the pulps coming along, but for decades prior to that, there was something called the amateur journalism movement,
Mhm.
and it was where it was kind of akin to podcasts today, where people would get together and write things and publish them themselves. So, for example, I just happen to have one handy. I got stacks of these around here, but one
Okay.
of them was the tryout. So the
Oh, neat.
tryout was by. Oop, I'm disappearing in my. Let me turn off my background and fix that real quick.
All right.
Uh, there we go. So there's the tryout. So
Okay.
this is from 1925. So this is
Mhm.
later in Lovecraft's life. So this is just one example. This is his friend Tryout Smith,
Mhm.
Charles W. Smith, who lived up in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and had his own amateur journal, The Tryout. And so Lovecraft's story In the Vault appeared in this one in 1925.
Oh, very cool.
And so these little things, this is probably one of the longer running ones. This went on for decades that Smith published this one. And this is probably one of the more cheaply produced ones because Smith just had his own printer. You can see he bound them himself with just thread. So
Mhm.
every single one of these was hand bound by Smith. And so Lovecraft and people he knew would put together these amateur journals. So Lovecraft created an amateur journal called The Conservative, and most of the content at the start was his own writings,
Mhm.
poems, essays, that sort of thing, stories. But he got friends to contribute. And so people would collect all this material together and print these and distribute them amongst friends and so on. So
Mhm.
because of his writing in the letters of magazines, the letters columns of magazines like the Argosy, a fellow who was the president of one of these amateur journalism organizations contacted Lovecraft and suggested he join. That prior to this, he was unfamiliar with these. So
Okay.
that's when he started doing this, publishing his own conservative and contacting other people in the movement and so on. And so there was this period, like I said, where for like 5 years, where Lovecraft was kind of aimless and didn't really know what to do with his life. And suddenly he was contacted by the amateur journalism movement. And within a couple of years, he was president of one of the organizations. He got
Okay.
very involved in this. And that's ultimately what led him into publishing in Weird Tales. People were so impressed with the stories that he wrote in the amateur publications that they said, "You should really send these to Weird Tales," which was starting up in the early 20s. And he sent 5 of his stories off to Weird Tales and said, these aren't especially good, but if you want them, I guess you can have them. And all I ask is, don't change anything at all, not a period or a semicolon. And it's like he couldn't have made it more difficult to accept his work, and yet they accepted all 5 of them.
Okay.
So that's when he started. That's when he broke into publishing commercially, and he wasn't being paid very much for this.
Mhm.
So this period we're talking about, he moves in. His grandfather dies in 1904 when he's 14, and he moves into this smaller house with his mother, and he lives in that house the longest period, from basically when he's 14 to 34. So there's that period there where he's living in this house with his mother, and this is the period during which he's finishing up high school and joining the amateur journalism movement and breaking into Weird Tales. But in 1919, his mother has a nervous breakdown.
Okay.
Lack of money, raising a son by herself, what have you. And so Lovecraft's 29 at this point, still living with his mother, and she, with this nervous breakdown, enters Butler Hospital as well,
Mhm.
where his father had entered, and where his father passed away. So his mother's there for a couple of years, and at one point, she has gallbladder surgery. And one of the things they have to do during gallbladder surgery is make sure they drain the wound properly, and they didn't. It goes septic, and she passes away in the hospital.
Mhm.
So the same hospital his mother and father went to for psychological reasons, and then both of them die in the same hospital. So you would think at this point, um, Lovecraft's all of a sudden on his own at age 31, living in this house. His one of his aunts does come and live because I think at that point she had been divorced. Um, but literally within a couple months of his mother dying, he goes to an amateur journalism convention in Boston.
Mhm.
Just within 2 months of her passing away, and he was miserable about her passing. He wrote this poem called Despair that has a very poesque feel to it.
Mhm.
But he goes to Boston and he ends up meeting the woman who in 3 years would become his wife. And not surprisingly, he doesn't really pursue her. It's her that pursues him. She's learned about him through the amateur journalism publications and what have you, and learns about him and finds him a fascinating character.
Okay.
So, as I said, he is living with his aunt at this point, and he has done some traveling around New England, visiting friends, staying with friends, and that sort of thing. Hasn't done some very much widespread traveling, but he's gone to New York a couple of times with some friends. At one point, he actually makes a trip to Cleveland, of all places, to visit with several amateur journalism people that he's met.
Mhm.
But in 1924, he goes to New York City to visit Sonia, his wife to be, and marries her and moves in with her in her house in her apartment in Brooklyn without telling his aunts.
Oh.
So he writes this crazy letter about how, oh, I got on the train and I took it. And there was some scenery on the way, and I got to New York and I, met Sonia at the train station. We went to her place and so on. It just goes on and on and on for a couple of pages, and then talks about them visiting St. Paul's Church in the South End of Manhattan, and
Mhm.
suddenly they're getting married. It's just out of the blue. He just kind
Hmm.
of mentions this to his aunt, very peculiar, and leaves her um, with the difficulties of having his stuff boxed up and moved to New York City for him. Very peculiar. So he stays there in New York City in Brooklyn with Sonia for 2 years. And at first, he's thrilled at the prospect, this new adventure, new wife, new home, new city, many of his friends in the amateur journalism movement. But she's running a hat shop. She's a milliner, and she has her own hat shop in Brooklyn, and it goes out of business within a couple months. And he's never had any type of real job in his entire life.
Mhm.
And he really isn't suited to a job. He's got some friends that make some recommendations. They say, "Oh, you could work for this company or help out with this and that sort of thing," and nothing ever pans out. And so she ends up getting an offer from a company in Cleveland and moves away. Still married, but she moves away so they can make some money. And he's increasingly becoming dissatisfied, shall we say, with New York City. In fact, to be blunt, he ends up hating it there, absolutely hating it. And one of the elements he hates is just he's used to living in Providence, obviously, for the
Mhm.
first 34 years of his life. And Providence at that time is a fairly rural city. Even today, I was kind of surprised at just what a small town feel Providence still has at this time. And so that's what he was accustomed to. And he was living on the edge of Providence, at the edge of town, where it was somewhat rural. And he talks about open spaces, undeveloped areas north of his home. And so all of a sudden, he's living in this enormous city. And one of the things that really grates on him are all the immigrants. He's always had a kind of a racist streak that he exposes in his letters to his aunts. But it goes up to 11 while he's in New York City, and he really says some nasty, hateful things about about non-whites in New York City. Um, so he's hating that more and more, and he ends up moving into a separate apartment on his own because Sonia had a big apartment and they just didn't need that big a space. So he moves in on his own at the end of 1924, at the very start of 1925. and he's living there by himself. And it's just getting worse and worse. And he's writing a few stories, but just not much to speak of. And it's clear he wants to go back to Providence. And he talks with his aunts in letters about the potential of moving to Boston, for example, because there would probably be some commercial possibilities for him in Boston. But he just can't bring himself to not return to Providence. In fact, in all the time he's in New York City, he explores areas outside New York, some small towns nearby. But not once does he take the train back to Providence. He just can't bring himself to do that. So finally, one of his aunts says, come back to Providence. The building that I'm in has a spare apartment, and boom, he's gone, just like that. He's back to Providence, and he loves it. He's just thrilled, and he writes these letters, these glowing letters about how thrilled he is to be back in Providence. And one of them, he writes in inch-tall letters, "I am Providence," and underlines it multiple times, and he just loves it here.
Mhm.
And that first year that he's back in Providence, you can tell all the energy, the creative energy that was bottled up inside of him. In that 1 year period, that 12-month period after he moves back to Providence, he writes so much. It's easily his most prolific year of his life. And he writes what I call the three C's. He writes The Call of Cthulhu, which is his best known story by far. He writes The Color Out of Space, which is his own personal favorite of all his stories. And he writes The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is his longest story and my favorite.
Mhm.
But he also writes The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which is also one of his longest stories. He writes Pickman's Model, which is set in Boston. He writes The Silver Key, which is a very autobiographical short story. And all that's just in this 1 year period. And
Wow.
so he just explodes with creativity, and it's just amazing what he does. So he moves back in Providence, and then the question is, well, what's to become of Sonia? And so for the next, 3 years, they see each other on occasion. There's one point where they meet in Hartford, Connecticut, of all places, and she's trying to reconcile things, but he just doesn't want to do so. And she concludes that they need to be officially divorced. So uh, she, presents the papers and so on, and he goes through the motions, but he can't bring himself to sign and file the papers. So for the rest of her life, she believes, well, not quite, for the rest of his life, she believes that they are divorced. And it comes out after he dies. When she's moved to California and married someone else, she discovers she never was divorced legally.
Oh, wow.
Now, it's not like she's intentionally a bigamist or anything like this.
Right. She didn't know. Yeah.
Right. She didn't know. So he can't bring himself to sign those papers. So he moves back to Providence in 1926. So he's 35 at this point. And he only lives to 46. He's only got 11 years left. And in that time, he writes all his mature fiction. Okay. It kicks off with 1926. There are a few noteworthy pieces prior than that, but 26 is really when it kicks off. And he travels extensively up and down the Eastern Seaboard, visiting friends all over the place. He makes it up to Quebec City and Montreal on 3 occasions in 1930, 32, and 33.
Mhm.
He gets down to Florida and visits with his friend Robert H. Barlow, which is a real surprise to him. He shows up in Barlow's town of DeLand, Florida, and gets off the bus and is like, "Oh, you're 13." It was a total surprise to Lovecraft because Barlow was writing, fiction and poetry like an adult
Okay.
and wrote
Wow.
like it in letters and so on, and spent considerable time with the Barlow family in Florida. He even made it all the way to Key West, Florida. He traveled, like I said, he had traveled previously to Cleveland. He makes several journeys to the south. He really loved St. Augustine, Florida, for all of its antiquity. He loved the warmth there too. He really hated the cold in New England. He visited Charleston, one of his favorite cities, on a few occasions. He got to New Orleans, visited with his friend E. Hoffman Price. I think the first time they got together, they talked for like 24 hours nonstop or something crazy like that.
Oh, wow.
So, and he talks about all these travels. He writes extensively to his aunts at home about his travels, and really enjoyed just seeing the antiquities and architecture of different places in the U.S. As a matter of fact, when he was on his trip to New Orleans, he went by kind of an interesting route. When he describes it prior to going on the trip, he talks about the cities he's going through, and he says he's going to be going through Nashville.
Oh,
And
interesting.
and so I was reading an article which mentioned he visited Nashville, and I was like, strange that he never mentions it. So I find those two references where he mentions it prior to going, but after going, he never mentions it. It's because the route he took ultimately didn't go through Nashville.
Okay.
He went down the eastern side of Tennessee through Knoxville,
Mhm.
and then down to Chattanooga, and then west through the Tennessee Valley over to Memphis, and then south.
Okay. Well,
So he
and
just kind of skirts the south, the east and southern edges
yeah.
of Tennessee.
Well, and Jeannie is from the east side of the state, close to Knoxville, and I'm actually from the west side from Memphis, and then we met here in the middle working together.
All
So,
right. Yeah, and Knoxville just he mentions it in passing. He doesn't say anything about it. It's like a
Mhm.
list of cities. This city, comma, Knoxville, comma, that city, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
He did write some letters on letterhead for a hotel in Knoxville,
Okay.
but I've seen no evidence he actually stopped there. It's possible he stopped there, checked some bags, and wandered around or something like that, and just grabbed some letterhead or something. He does that frequently because he gets paper from wherever he can get it because he wrote really, really long letters.
Mhm.
So he needed lots of paper to write on. And then Chattanooga, he mentions Lookout Mountain, and he mentions the caves there that he got to explore, and he mentions the train, the General, which I think is stored in Atlanta now, but it was in Union Depot in Chattanooga at the time.
Okay.
Talks about the Cumberlands. He thought the Cumberlands were gorgeous, and the Tennessee Valley, looking over the valley and the river, he thought was beautiful. And he says all he says about Memphis is it's where he first saw the Mississippi.
Okay.
So he really doesn't say a lot um, about Tennessee, but I figured I'd look up what I could find.
Yeah, no, I thank you
I
for
knew you were both
sharing
from
that.
Tennessee.
That's really cool. Yeah.
So, like I said, he did lots of traveling. There's a common misconception that Lovecraft was something of a recluse, a real stay-at-home, and that was true prior to his mother's death. He didn't do much traveling except within New England. I'm not even sure he got outside of Rhode Island and Massachusetts before that point. But after his mother's death, and in fact, after he left New York, after he and Sonia broke it off, that's when the bulk of his traveling really took place. And he was remarkably well traveled up and down the East Coast.
Okay.
So during this period, he's also writing more and more in Weird Tales and becoming a better known author within its pages to the point where, Weird Tales is advertising, we're going to have a Lovecraft story in the next issue. And everybody's like, oh, I can't wait to read this issue. So he never, within his lifetime, he never had a cover illustration that featured one of his stories. His name would be on the front cover, but never an illustration of one of his stories. The one exception is he ghost wrote a story for Harry Houdini of all people, named "Imprisoned with the Pharaohs," and that that story did get a front cover illustration. And
Hmm.
so I think what happened is Houdini contacted the editor of Weird Tales, and Houdini was always, a showman, always promoting himself. And he thought, oh, Weird Tales is popular. I'll get some stories published in there. I got a few ideas. He contacted the editor. They put him in touch with Lovecraft, and that's how Lovecraft wrote the story. And so Lovecraft got to meet with Houdini on a couple of occasions. Once, I think, when he was performing here in Providence, and once in New York City.
Okay.
So his fame was growing, but his money really wasn't because the pulps really didn't pay much. In addition, Lovecraft wasn't a commercial writer. He wasn't cranking these stories out the way so many others. There was um, an author, Seabury Quinn, that was just knocking stuff out in the pages of Weird. Is like almost every issue of Weird Tales, he had something in there, and so there were authors who were really writing quite a bit, but Lovecraft never felt that was his role. He always felt, keep in mind, he had come from money in a sense, at least the first 14 years of his life. And so he always felt he was kind of a country gentleman of sorts, and that this was his craft, this was his art, and it wasn't something that should be sullied with commercialism. And so
Mhm.
it was something he was doing because he loved it, he enjoyed it, and he did it when the mood struck. And on a few occasions, he wrote something um, that was to order. For example, when he wrote Herbert West Reanimator, he wrote that for his acquaintance George Julian Hutain was publishing a new magazine called Homebrew that was supposed to be a humor magazine of all things. And so he wrote those to spec, essentially. There were 6 chapters. Each one had to have an introduction that repeated what happened in the previous story and so on. So he really hated doing that kind of work. But he also, to kind of try to make ends meet, he also offered his services up as a revision client, where he would revise other people's stories so they could be published. More often than not, that involved him completely rewriting their stories.
Wow.
And sometimes some of these people would give him a sentence, like, I got this idea, and it'd be a sentence, and he would turn that into a 30-page story or something like that. And so he would always go above and beyond. And they were clearly, you read these stories and they are now classified amongst his own stories because they're clearly almost entirely by Lovecraft, if not wholly by Lovecraft.
Well, and I think I read that he did some ghostwriting, I think, towards the end of his career.
Yeah, there were a number of people that just contacted him through Weird Tales and so on.
Okay.
And I remember he and his friend Frank Belknap Long at one point put an advertisement in a paper or something like that, offering revisory services.
Okay.
So he made some additional money that way, but I can't imagine it being very efficient because I think he spent way too much effort and transformed the stories he received from other people into something completely different.
Yeah.
And again, there were instances where people would send him a sentence. I've got this idea, and he would make an entire story. And so I don't think he really made much money doing that sort of work.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this period, like I said, from around 1926 to 1937, he's writing his mature pieces, his oeuvre. These are the pieces that make Lovecraft. And in 1932, his older Aunt Lillian passes away, and he ends up moving into another home with his Aunt Annie, who is divorced at this point. And that's the final home he lives in. He loves this house. It's a Georgian home, built in 1825, a late Georgian, late Federal, more correctly. And he really enjoys this house because it's the oldest house he's lived in. And it's the kind of architecture that he really appreciates in New England. So he loves that house. And he sets the story, The Haunter of the Dark, in that house. And all the elements of the house are right in that story. There's obviously a lot of fiction, monsters and stuff like that in the story, but the house, the details of the house are spot on in that story. By this point, he's also met he's made another correspondent, Robert Bloch, who went on to write Psycho years later. He's met him through letters and so on, through the pulps. And at this time, Bloch is 15 years old. So he's meeting these young people, and he's kind of like, he always speaks of himself as being a grandpa, even when he's younger. He refers to his aunts, who are clearly older than him, as his grandchildren. So he always acts like he's this older man who's here to give advice. And so later in life, Bloch said Lovecraft was my university. So Bloch decides he wants to write a story in which a character based on Lovecraft is killed off. So he puts together a little contract and sends it to Lovecraft, and it says, I, Lovecraft, hereby authorize Robert Bloch to kill me off in a story. He signs it, so on. So Poe writes. Oh, there I go. So got to keep them all straight. So Bloch writes a story, The Shambler from the Stars, in which this character goes to Providence, and this guy clearly modeled on Lovecraft is killed off. Lovecraft returns the favor by writing The Haunter of the Dark, in which a character named Robert Blake comes from Minneapolis and is killed off. And then after Lovecraft's death, Bloch ties it up by writing The Shadow from the Steeple. So there's a trilogy of stories where the two of them write back and forth. Now, in late 1936, Lovecraft starts complaining that he's not feeling well. He says he's got something called the grip, which is a Victorian term, just general term for malaise. Grip, Grippe,
Mhm.
not feeling well, and it gets worse and worse. And finally, he ends up on March 10th, 1937, going to the hospital. And he's checked into the hospital, and they quickly find out he's got intestinal cancer. He's got kidney disease. He's a mess, and his belly's swelling up with fluid, and they're draining it. He tries to keep a diary, which later referred to as a death diary. And day by day, he's trying to write how he's doing. And it consists of little more than pain, unimaginable pain, can't go on. It's just stuff like that for days. And 5 days after he's admitted, he passes away on March 15th, 1937.
Mhm.
At the time he passes away, um, he in the Phillips plot at Swan Point Cemetery where he's buried, which his grandfather Whipple Van Buren Phillips purchased that lot. There's a central obelisk, a central monument, and all the family members have their names inscribed on it. And at the time Lovecraft dies, and at the time his mother dies back in 1921, their names are inscribed on the back of the monument, but they don't have individual stones. When Lovecraft's father died in 1898, his name's inscribed on the back, and he has a stone as well. But at the time Susie and Howard die,
Mhm.
no stone because they haven't the money for it.
Okay.
And Lovecraft's Aunt Annie ends up dying 4 years later herself. And she's buried there as well in Swan Point. It's not until the 1970s that fans get together and they raise the funds for Susie and Howard to have their own stones. And they're designed to look like Winfield, Lovecraft's father's stone as well. So
Mhm.
all the family rests there today. So Lovecraft, during his lifetime, became fairly well known in his own circles, in the amateur journalism circles and the pulp circles, that sort of thing, and very loved amongst his friends. Uh,
Mhm.
but after his death and his aunt's death, there was no family members to live on at that point. After his death in 37, two of his acquaintances, two of his correspondents, August Derleth and Donald Wandry, decided we need to keep Lovecraft's works alive. And so they started a company called Arkham House to publish Lovecraft's work in hardback. And so that's what they did in 1939. They published The Outsider and others, which is worth thousands of dollars now. And Arkham House, I think Arkham House is defunct at this point. Um, one of the fellows who started, August Derleth, had a daughter, and I think his grandkids are still in charge of some of the assets of the company, but I think it's pretty much dissolved at this point. But over the decades, Arkham House published a lot of well-known horror and sci-fi authors.
Okay.
And it was in the 1970s when Arkham House permitted other publishers to publish Lovecraft in paperback that really Lovecraft's fame really took off. And it's funny I say Arkham House permitted him. August Derleth claimed to own the copyrights on Lovecraft's works because of an arrangement he had made with Lovecraft's aunt. And if you look at those documents, it's clear she did not transfer copyright ownership to Arkham House, but he took it as such and he ran with it. So in the 70s, like I said, the paperbacks came out and Lovecraft became much better known then. That was probably, I suspect I started reading Lovecraft around 1980 is my guess.
Okay.
Soon after these paperbacks started appearing. And of course today, Lovecraft's um, the tentacles of his creation are found everywhere. It's amazing how well known he is in popular culture circles. It may not have been until 1981 I discovered Lovecraft. There was a role-playing game, the Call of Cthulhu, or just simply Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing
Mhm.
game. And I didn't play it at the time, but I do remember seeing it in a game store, and that may have tipped me off to Lovecraft. But his creations, I should talk about those briefly. One of the things he created that is so well known is something that's now called, he never referred to it as such, now called the Cthulhu mythos, named after the creature from the story of the Call of Cthulhu. And it's variously pronounced, Cthulhu, Cthulhu, Clulu. There's you pick your poison. It really doesn't matter. If you say any one of those, people are gonna probably know what you're talking about because it didn't sound like anything else. Uh,
Good point.
so so what this mythos was really a collection of different things like these creatures that he created. So creatures like Cthulhu and Azathoth and Shub-Niggurath, all these kinds of creatures that figure in his stories. Lesser creatures like deep ones and ghouls, but also a variety of different books, like the Necronomicon, which I mentioned earlier, which is kind of a medieval grimoire of sorts, but written in the 9th century, I believe, by an Arab. Um, and Other books like the Book of Ibon and Unausprechlichen Kulten, or Unspeakable Cults. And many of these things were created not just by Lovecraft, but by his friends. He had friends that also created things and would write stories and borrow from Lovecraft. And so it was a shared universe that they all created together. And imagine what it was like being a reader of Weird Tales and reading a Lovecraft story that mentions these things. And then you read a story by Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, and there's these things in that story too. And you're like, what's going on here? Is there some mythology that I'm not familiar with? And it must have been kind of exciting to be readers at this time to discover this stuff.
Mhm.
And then for my own purposes, one of the elements I find interesting is Lovecraft also created these fictional locations. So his best known one is probably Arkham, but also Dunwich and Kingsport and Innsmouth.
Mhm.
These are all based on real world places, most of them on the North Shore of Boston in Essex County.
Okay.
And so these creatures, these tomes, these places, all these combine to be kind of the window dressing, as it were, of the Cthulhu mythos.
Okay. Yeah, it's a lot of, his life and what he went through and everything he created, and just thinking about kind of bringing back Poe into this and like his influence. And I could see where Lovecraft could connect to Poe, especially with the loss that both of them
Mm.
suffered. And just as, young people growing into adulthood, losing lots of their important people in their life.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
there was a
where
lot of
you can
loss,
make those connections, like, hey, I have something in common with him.
right?
A lot
So,
of parallels too that I
yeah,
noticed with Poe and Lovecraft as far as, their monetary success versus
yes,
their popularity. Their kind of abrupt deaths that kind of lasted a few days, and then the lack of a stone, and then fans coming together decades
yes.
later to then erect a stone, and a lot of parallels, yeah, that I
Yeah.
really did not notice even before until Donovan was just going through Lovecraft's biography, that I made those connections. And yeah,
Yeah.
pretty significant. You can see how Poe really resonated for Lovecraft.
Mhm.
Yeah. And obviously, Poe died when he was 40, and Lovecraft only made it to 46.
Mhm.
And like Levi said, their mixed success. And the other thing is they were clearly interested in elevating their art to a literary form. They're interested in writing horror, which so many people still today look down. They don't see it as a legitimate form of literature.
Mhm.
And so they were very interested in elevating it. They were very interested in honing their art and um, taking a much more literary approach to things than so many of their contemporaries would. Lovecraft complained incessantly about all the people writing for Weird Tales and how they would focus on um, unimportant details, and he would complain about plot, plot, plot. As if why do they have to worry so much? Focus so much on the plot and action. He used to refer to it as action, because he was just making fun of it and of specific people who pronounced it certain ways, certain people he
Mhm.
knew. But yeah, he was more interested in trying to write art. And now that said, there's certainly a lot of Lovecraft that you could argue really is very pulpish anyway. Um, he's when you think about it, he's writing around about monsters here.
Yeah.
I think it may have been Lovecraft scholar David E. Schultz who said something like, "Come for the monsters, stay for the ideas." And the idea behind so much of Lovecraft's writing is what's now called cosmic fiction or cosmic horror.
Mhm.
Lovecraft's worldview, Lovecraft was a staunch atheist. He referred to himself as a mechanistic materialist, And by that he meant that he believed the world was a materialist one. There was no supernatural element to it. He didn't believe in the supernatural in the least. So no God, no soul, no ghosts, anything like that. He believed it was purely materialistic, and he believed it was mechanistic. It was a big machine, a big clockwork, and that mankind didn't have uh, free will. It was all an illusion. And it's just we're just grinding from, as he put it, from nothing to something and back to nothing again. So there's, before we exist, there's nothing, and after we die, there's nothing. And he had this, a very kind of dark view on the universe. And so his idea of cosmic horror is that uh, mankind, as he learns more about the cosmos, he discovers there's nothing out there. There's nothing that cares about him. And any forces that seem inimical to man aren't aren't after us because they hate us or they want to destroy us. It's because they just don't care. They don't even notice it. Just as you're walking down the street and you accidentally step on an ant hill and kill a few dozen ants, you don't even notice it. And
Mhm.
so these forces that are at work in his stories, that's what they are like. They just don't notice mankind as they steamroll over him. So
Mhm.
that um, idea, that cosmic horror, it's a horror that's not internal, it's external, looking out into the cosmos and seeing how insignificant we are. That's really prevalent throughout so much of his stories. And it is kind of interesting how so many of his stories will start with a pulpish center to them, but then Lovecraft's got this philosophical tale to tell.
Yeah. Definitely. So, and one of the things, just kind of doing some research, and also I've been preparing, like, and I don't know if you can see it, but reading, just, this is a paperback copy of
Yep.
Waking Up Screaming, that has some of his stories in it, and I can definitely see some elements that similar to Poe but different,
Yeah.
and in some of the stories, one of the ones that I really enjoyed was Cool Air, was
Mhm.
one of the first ones I read in this collection, and it was a really creepy tale, but it was definitely, I thought, Poe-esque.
Yeah, that's one of the ones that people kind of zero in on when they read Lovecraft and they think, okay, that's got a very strong Poe influence. It sounds like it was inspired by the Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar.
Absolutely, yes.
And one of Lovecraft's correspondents asked him about that particular story, and he said, no, not at all. That was not. He wasn't thinking of Valdemar at all.
Yeah.
He was thinking of, I think it's is it the White People? Trying to remember which story. It was a Mackin story. Oh, the novel of the White Powder. That's what it is.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, the novel of the White Powder.
Mhm.
That was his inspiration. It's a story in which a young man takes this white powder and just dissolves. Uh,
Okay, and that
and
that definitely makes sense. It
yeah,
definitely does. Yeah. But I felt that mesmerism, when I was
yes.
reading it, and I was like, But so, well, since we're talking about Poe, so you said that he discovered Poe when he was 8 years old. So what was it about Poe that influenced him?
Specifically, what was it?
Or
I'll send this over to Levi. No.
Yeah, but let's see.
oh,
I got a quote from him. He says, then I struck Edgar Allan Poe. It was my downfall. And at the age of 8, I saw the blue firmament of Argos and Sicily. He was interested in Greek and Roman
mhm.
mythology. The firmament of Argos and Sicily darkened by the miasmal exhalations of the tomb.
Right.
So that dark element is
Mhm.
clearly what appealed to him. What specifically, I don't know. It just clicked with him, and he really took off. There was really a period from about 1917. So it's interesting because when Lovecraft was young, I think the oldest work we have from him, I think, is probably from 1895. So he was 5 years old. So some of his real juvenilia still exists. And so he wrote some for a few years when he was very young, but he kind of turned away from it for several years until the amateur journalism movement got him back on track again in 1915. Um, Now, the period though that he where he wrote his most Poe-esque works are probably around 1917 to 1923. So again, that you generally just add 10 years to that. So it's when he's 27 to um, 33 years old. So that's,
Okay.
a fairly mature period there.
Mhm.
So the most significant first story he wrote that was Poe-esque is The Tomb.
Okay.
And it probably has some, I've read that it's got some similarities to Ligeia and Berenice. But the idea behind the story is that there's this young man named Jervis Dudley, and he discovers in this wooded area a tomb for a family named the Hydes. And apparently they lived in a house nearby that is burned, and he's fascinated by this tomb he's found set into a hillside. And he visits it periodically, and he's this gloomy little kid. I think there's an implication at the start of the story that he's 10 years old when he starts visiting this tomb, and he visits it frequently and becomes convinced that he is descended from the Hydes, despite the differing back last name of Dudley. And he has this dream at one point, and he goes back to the attic of his home. It goes into this chest he's never seen before, and there's a key, and it opens the tomb.
Oh,
And he
wow.
spends his time hanging out in the tomb and has more dreams about the Hydes. And at one point, there's this dream he has, and it's questionable whether he's um, having a dream or a vision or he's transported exactly. But he goes back and um, he's in the home of the Hydes. There's this big lush party, and there's carriages pulling up, and lightning bolt strikes, and the house is burned. So he's kind of reliving the experience of the Hyde house burning.
Mhm.
And he comes to, and these men are grabbing him. Apparently, someone, probably his parents, have been spying on him, saying, where's our kid? What's he doing?" And they grab the kid, and he tells the story about how he, spending all this time in the tomb, but the guys who grab him say, "What are you talking about?" And they point towards the lock that is rusted as could be. And so who knows if he really discovered the key to the tomb or not. And they basically drag him off to the madhouse.
Okay.
It's got a very Poe-esque feeling to it. And at the end,
Absolutely. Yeah.
he talks about the niches and the coffins that are inside the tomb. And there's one that is inscribed with the initials. I'm trying to remember if it's JD or JH. It's either his name is Jervis Dudley, but he thinks himself a Hyde, so Jervis Hyde. But there's a niche, I think it has JH on it, that they promise him that when he dies, he'll be entombed there.
Oh, interesting.
A very, very Poe-esque story. So he wrote that when he was 26 years old.
Okay.
So even though he discovers Poe when he is 8, he's not really writing anything Poe-esque for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
He also wrote The Outsider. The Outsider is probably his most anthologized story. It's
Mm-hmm.
a weird kind of dreamlike story where this man is talking about he lives in some castle, and there's only one person that he can remember that takes care of him in the castle, someone that's elderly and wrinkled. And one day he decides he's going to climb to the tallest tower of the castle so he can see the moon. So he's going up, through staircase after staircase and through all these chambers and up to this tower. And he finally opens this trap door at the top, and he realizes he's at ground level.
Ooh.
I was like, what's going on? This underground castle of sorts.
Uh-huh.
And he wanders through these woods, and there's a above ground castle nearby, and there's a party going on. So he goes and figures out goes to explore the party. There's all these partiers and so on, and they turn to see him, and they all scream and run. And he doesn't say they turn to me and see me and scream. He just says they see something, and then he sees some motion, and he sees some monster in a through an archway, and he advances towards the monster, and just as he's about to get near it, he stumbles backwards and catches himself and reaches forward, and he touches the monster. Turns out it's a mirror. So he's seeing that he is some kind of decaying monstrosity. So
Okay.
he is the outsider. And people try to make much of that and say it's kind of a autobiographical because his mother literally would tell him he was an ugly child.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Oh.
And a lot goes into that, his peculiar relationship with his mother. But
Hmm.
I don't think I think he's just kind of aping a Poe-esque style in
Hmm.
telling the story that's somewhat dreamlike and obviously has a horrific element and twist at the end. In letters, he comments on how he was going to originally write the story about this ghoul, essentially, this reanimated creature who
Hmm.
climbs to the top of the tower and only then discovers he is below ground, discovers what he is. And that's the end of the story. And then he thought, oh, well, I'll extend the story and have him frighten these people. And so there'd be another twist, as it were. And then he said, and then I thought, well, I'll extend it even further and have him touch this mirror and see himself. So it
Okay.
was just this series of climaxes that he'd never intended. He'd write it to one point and then he'd extend the story to the next and the next.
Hmm.
He created three climaxes in it without originally intending to.
That's pretty incredible, really.
And the one of the possible influences there is Mask of the Red Death,
Yeah.
with the party scene and so on. There's a lot of similarities there to it.
Hmm. I would definitely say so. That's the one I have not read, and I'm in the middle of reading the Charles Dexter Ward
Oh,
story, and I've seen the Vincent Price movie, The
mhm,
Haunted Palace, but really the only thing named with Poe is just the
precisely.
poem taken from Fall of the House of Usher. But I love the movie.
Yeah.
It's well done, so I'm anxious to finish the
Price
story.
Price is fun. Who else is in that?
Let's see.
Deborah Paget
Yes, and
and is Elisha Cook? He's got a small role in it, I think.
maybe I can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, but it's a great film.
It's an unusual one too, because how far are you into the story?
Let's see. Hold on, and I can tell you. Let's see.
Because
I
I don't
am,
want to reveal any spoilers.
yeah. Oh, don't please. Let's see. Because I've been reading and let's see. I'm actually only about 25 pages in.
Oh, okay. You're pretty early.
It's early on, but I'm loving the story so far.
It's the differences between the story and the movie are kind of intriguing in a way,
Okay.
in that it makes one wonder, and I've seen instances of this where people have misread the story. I'm hesitant to say more.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
partly because of my bias toward the story. This is actually my favorite Lovecraft story by far. I don't recommend it to people because it is his longest work. When
Hmm.
people are new to Lovecraft, I generally recommend that they read something like Pickman's Model because it's
Yeah.
short and sweet. It's first person, set in Boston. It doesn't involve any of his Cthulhu mythos,
Yeah.
and so it's not too outlandish.
Hmm.
And so people are able to digest it much more easily than his longest work.
Hmm.
But yeah, the case of Charles Dexter Ward, there's just so much fabric to the story and so many wonderful hidden things in it that I'm still discovering.
Oh, wow.
Um, there are all kinds. When Lovecraft wrote the case of Charles Dexter Ward, he actually was planning that back when he was living in New York City. And there's a book called Providence in Colonial Times by a woman named Gertrude Selwyn Kimball. And they had a copy of it at the New York Public Library, but Lovecraft couldn't check it out. So he would literally go there to the reading room, check it out within the library, read it, return it, and come back the next day and read more. And he did that for weeks
Oh,
and
wow.
took copious notes. And there's elements he borrowed from her history book and incorporated them right into the story. And that is his love letter to Providence. He did some amazing things in that story, but he knew when he was done writing it, it was not going to sell. It was not going to be publishable. So he just literally threw it in a drawer and forgot about it. And it pretty much remained there till after his death.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's nothing short of remarkable that a readable version of it was ever prepared because the manuscript is so hard to read because he's crossing things out and writing things in margins and you're like, does this go with this? And it's an amazing manuscript. And so I don't have it handy offhand, but one of my favorite quotes from the story is actually not in the story. It's one of the lines he crossed out. And
Oh,
there's notes on the back. There's things he practiced on the back of sheets. There's some writing near the end of the story, some Latin minuscule uncial writing that he practiced on the backs of the pages, and it's interesting to watch his practice work. He'll do little outlines, like he'll talk about a character. He'll want to include biographical information about the character, and so he'll draw like a family tree on the back of the page, and when people died and moved to different countries and things like that, and all that kind of information is on the back of his manuscripts, and they're just amazing to look at, and you can learn all kinds of fascinating behind the scenes things.
Hmm.
He threw that, like I said, he threw it in a drawer, and it just was never published in his lifetime. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's his best work.
Well,
But
I
again,
to
not for
finish.
newbies. Yeah.
Oh, well, one of the things that you had mentioned as well is like Robert Bloch was heavily influenced by Lovecraft, and I've also read too that he, like Poe, was an influence. So, was there anyone else that really has been really influenced by Lovecraft that has
Oh, wow.
gone on from his writings?
It's hard for me to imagine that any horror author after Lovecraft hasn't been
Yeah,
influenced by Lovecraft in the same way that any horror author after Poe has not been, you know, it's hard to imagine that being the case.
yeah,
I mentioned during Lovecraft's time, he knew Robert E. Howard, who was the
yeah.
creator of Conan the Barbarian and
Mhm.
King Kull and Solomon Kane, Robert E. Howard wrote a lot of boxing stories, very strange, sub genre. Uh,
Mhm.
One of the people he knew through the pages of Weird Tales was Clark Ashton Smith, who was an author and poet and sculptor who lived in Auburn, California. Those three, Howard and Robert E. Howard and Lovecraft and Smith, were kind of the three musketeers of sorts of Weird Tales. There's so many authors that if you go back and look at Weird Tales, they have stories in volume, issue after issue after issue of Weird Tales that are completely forgotten today.
Mhm.
But Lovecraft and Howard are still well known. Smith, not quite so much.
Okay.
But yes, other people um, were in this circle of Lovecraft's friends. One of Lovecraft's best friends, Frank Belknap Long, who lived in New York City, he wrote stories set in Lovecraft's universe, had entire books of his works published. There was a fellow named Henry Kuttner and a woman named Catherine L. Moore that Lovecraft pretty much acted as matchmaker of sorts, introducing the two to each other, and they end up being married. Lovecraft knew a fellow named Fritz Leiber, who went on to be a science fiction author. So there were many within that what's now called the Lovecraft circle, within the time of the pulps, that were well known in their time, but many of them have faded from view somewhat. But since then, I mean, even Stephen King talks about the influence that Lovecraft had on him. So it's hard to imagine any modern author that hasn't. There have been many authors that were published by Arkham House, like Ramsey Campbell, for example.
Mhm.
My wife and I are reading, there have been numerous collections of Cthulhu mythos fiction. And during what I refer to as Halloween month, we started reading one of those collections because she'd never really read any mythos fiction. So I got out two copies of the books and we're reading them in parallel. And we're reading, what are we in the middle of right now? We're reading Colin Wilson's The Return of the Loigor, which we're really enjoying. So there's the number of influences. I mean, there's Simpsons episodes that have Cthulhu in them. I think there were 3 episodes of South Park where the kids in the show kind of team up against Cthulhu somehow. So so it's not just horror fiction. It seems like we've gotten to a point where we're at peak Cthulhu, where everybody knows what Cthulhu is.
Mhm.
It's a big squid thing, is all they know. They've they've heard of the Necronomicon, which has appeared in the Evil Dead movies.
Yeah.
Um, and they've heard of Arkham, although usually the reason they've heard of Arkham is because it got incorporated into the Batman universe.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So they created the Arkham Asylum back in, I think it was 1951, something like that.
Okay.
So there's not even a Lovecraft element there. There's just this asylum that's um, based on I guess it was given by a family called the Arkhams in the Batman universe.
Okay.
Whereas in Lovecraft's world, there's a town called Arkham. That's why
Hmm.
the sanitarium's there.
Okay. That all that is really fascinating. So anything else that Donovan or Levi you want to add about Providence and Lovecraft, Poe? I mean, it's just really cool that, Poe and Lovecraft both, Lovecraft more than Poe, but still there's that influence still standing today for both of them in Providence.
Right. Yeah, and Lovecraft, of course, loved the connection that Poe had to Providence, and he
Yeah.
celebrated it. And he, took pictures of himself in front of Sarah Helen Whitman's house, right, Donovan? And
Yep. And the Poe
maybe a
got it.
fun, yeah, yeah. And right, what was that article that you sent me? The Shrines of Poe,
Oh yeah,
or
Lovecraft wrote an essay called Homes and Shrines of Poe, which basically he went through Poe's life and almost told a little biography of Poe, but told it in terms of geography. Poe lived in this house, then he went to this house, and he went
Mhm.
to West Point, and this was his a room number at West Point, and his the room he stayed at the University of Virginia, and so on, and where he's buried, and all this sort of thing. And so all those points of interest, the overwhelming majority of them, Lovecraft tracked them down and visited them. And
That's
enjoyed,
neat.
yeah, enjoyed spotting these places. Really, really enjoyed that sort of thing, that kind of exploration. And that's kind of what I do too. I follow in Lovecraft's footsteps and track down the places that he's mentioned, some of which are gone. There was an article I wrote years ago where, in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, it mentions that Joseph Kerwin, the antagonist of the story, has a home here in Providence. And I was able to figure out the house Lovecraft had in mind for Joseph Kerwin. Found out why he mentions it. It turns out one of the family servants lived in the house, so that's why he picked that house. That's why he knew about it.
Mhm.
Um, and even though the house was probably demolished around 1931, I was able to find an historic photograph of the house. So we now know, sure enough, it matches the description Lovecraft gave for it. And it probably took me, like I said, off and on over 5 years to track that information down. And that's what I love doing, is just rooting out these mysteries in Lovecraft. In fact, Joseph Kerwin had may have had a house in Salem. There's an implication of it in more in what he removed from the story than in what's in the story.
Mhm.
And I've found that house. It burned at one point and then was torn down, I think, in 1925. And so I'm in the process of trying to find photographs of that or some other information about it.
Mhm.
Doing that kind of detective work is what I really enjoy doing. That's the bulk of the work I do behind the scenes. So you may see my name in the acknowledgments to a variety of different books, but that's how I'm contributing. I'm either contributing photographs or geographic details.
Mhm. Yeah, and your website is amazing. I've looked through that and read several things before the episode and just learned so much that I didn't know. So thank you for that.
Certainly.
Mhm.
I'm working on a couple of databases behind the scene, like all the geographic research I'm doing. I'm putting that into a database, but I'm also building kind of a bibliographic database that'll kind of serve as the backbone to it, so that I can add and remove books and other information. Right now, some of that's exposed, like I've got uh, in the database, I've got information about some Lovecraft journals, um, magazines, and so on, like Crypt of Cthulhu, Lovecraft Studies, and Lovecraft Annual. So I've got an index of those you can search on the site. So I'm slowly building that sort of stuff up. Now that I retired, I was a software developer, and so I'm putting that to use on my website, building things behind the scene. But it's a lot of work, and I get lots of emails that I'm answering all the time too.
I can imagine. Well, Jeannie and I both want to say thank you very much for coming on here with us. Yeah, Donovan, you have provided so much information that I know our listeners and viewers are going to love to hear. So, and Levi as well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad I could make the connection, between you guys and Donovan, so that he could allow your listeners to really get to know Lovecraft in a very factual and accurate way.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, Donovan, you're so knowledgeable. I was going to say, I know we probably didn't even like hit, a quarter of what you could talk about with Lovecraft. And so you may have to come on later on for another episode.
Oh, yeah,
Part two.
there you
Yes,
go.
yes, and maybe pinpoint some specific things, and we'll have to ask the listeners and viewers if they want to know like anything specific. So that would be
Yeah,
great.
if folks are interested in Lovecraft, just go to hplovecraft.com.
Okay.
All of Lovecraft's fiction is on the site. I've got few dozen of his poems. He was quite the poet. Not the poet Poe was. Most of Lovecraft's poetry is very mechanical, but his satirical poetry and his weird poetry is pretty good. And he also was quite the essayist. There's 5 volumes that have been published of his essays. I've got just a smattering of those online. To those interested in Poe, they may want to read Supernatural Horror in Literature,
Hmm.
which gives kind of an outline of the history of supernatural horror up to Lovecraft's time, and he's got a whole chapter devoted to Poe.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, and if you've got any questions, there's a contact link at the bottom of every page on the site. So feel free to send questions.
All right.
Not too
Awesome.
many.
Jeannie, anything else you can think of?
No, I think everything was pretty much covered and covered very well. And we now instead of just 6 degrees of Poe, it's like 6 degrees of Poe to 6 degrees of Poe.
Yes.
Because we now have our connections to connections to connections, so it all
Yes.
works out. And Donovan has his shall I say obsession with tracing the steps of Lovecraft, but there is nothing wrong with that. And then Levi, we know, has an obsession of doing his tours and chasing his Poe connections with Sarah Whitman, because we talked about that during the Halloween thing, that
Yeah.
he finally got to go in and maybe meet a little bit of Poe's ghost, so that was cool. So
Yeah, maybe so. Or Mrs. Whitman. I don't know.
Yes.
I,
Yes.
yeah, it could have been either one. Could have been either one. They may have both been there and just said hello
Maybe.
through that way.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
So that was good. So, well, no, we definitely thank all our connections for giving us more and giving our listeners and our viewers more and giving them what they want. Because, like Carmen said at the very beginning, our fans asked for the Lovecraft connection and the Poe influence. And I think we have thoroughly gone over that, but we still have more, just like with Poe. There's always something more coming up. So thank you both for joining us today. We appreciate you on our episode about horror.
Yes.
Thank you much.
So
And Jeannie, on that note,
we are Poe
out.
In each nook most melancholy, there the traveler meets aghast sheeted memories of the past, shrouded forms that start and sigh as they pass the wanderer by, white-robed forms of friends long given, in agony to the worms and heaven.
Until our next connection,
On our podcast,
keep Poe alive.